Hi, I'm Bill Niefert, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 320 for April 17th, 2023. And I'll be talking today with Bill Niefert from Corellium. And Corellium is a company that makes virtualization products that help people to test stuff without having to use the real hardware to do it. And why is that important? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit today when we interview Bill. Now, there are several technical things that come up during this interview that aren't terribly important to probably most of you, but I will just real quickly do my usual pre-interview glossary segment where I'll quickly define some of these terms. So as you hear them, you at least know what they're talking about. And one of the major things that Corellium does is work with what are called ARM processors. That's ARM. And that stands for Advanced RISC Machines. And that's not RISK. RISC is another acronym, RISC, which stands for Reduced Instruction Set Computer, as opposed, of course, to CISC machines or Complex Instruction Set Computers. So what does that all mean? It doesn't really matter too much, but just so you know, there are two basic types of processors, two families of processors that run in computers and all the computing devices that we have. And those are CISC processors and RISC processors. CISC processors are more like the Intel type chips, the AMD type chips, the x86 style chips. And then there's this other type called RISC computers, reduced instruction set computers, of which ARM is by far the most popular architecture variety, which is in everything, as we're going to find today in our interview. These little suckers are all over the place, and it's really amazing how much they've kind of taken over the computing world. They could be very low power, they could be much smaller, they have a lot of potential advantages. We'll also talk about virtualization and hypervisors, and this is basically about emulating or simulating a computer in software running on another computer. If you've ever used VMware or Parallels that allowed you to maybe run Linux on your Mac or Windows on your Mac, for example, this is a version of running virtualization. And what these guys are virtualizing are devices like smartphones and IoT devices. Bill talks about jailbreaking, and this is the notion of getting past the built-in security measures on a device that will let you do whatever you want, basically. This is more common on like a mobile device, like on a cell phone or a tablet that has built-in security measures that's supposed to keep you from getting, from getting malware, but also from installing stuff that the manufacturer doesn't want you to install. We talk about pen testing or penetration testing. This is essentially hacking, but hacking for the purpose of improving the security, like trying to hack in, and if you're successful, patching those holes so that by the time you ship the product with that software running on it, you have hopefully secured it against malicious hacking. And we also briefly discuss DDoS attacks, that's distributed denial of service. And a lot of times what happens with hacked IoT devices is they get recruited into these things called botnets, where they can be told to mess with some other computer on the internet. Like if you get 1,000 of these IoT devices recruited into your botnet, and you can command and control them from anywhere on the internet, you can instruct all of these compromised devices to send a whole bunch of traffic to this web server to try to bring it down, or maybe have it send a bunch of spam emails or things like that. So anyway, we rattle off a lot of these terms, and as usual, I wanted to kind of prep you for that so that when those things come up in the interview, you at least know kind of what we're talking about. Now, you will notice my voice sounds a little funny in this interview. I don't know what was going on this day. I had a little bit of a frog in my throat, so I sounded just a little bit off, and so you'll probably notice that. But anyway, that's plenty to set up this interview. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get to my interview with Bill Niefert from Corellium. Bill Niefert is the Senior Vice President for Partnerships at Corellium. And prior to Corellium, Bill led the marketing organization for the tools group at ARM, A-R-M. We'll talk about that a little bit today. And was CTO and co-founder at Carbon Design Systems. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Oh, thank you very much, Kerry. It's good to be here.
The Internet of Things craze has been going strong for many years now. And every appliance or electronic device has some sort of smart version today. It's just, it's some way to get us to rebuy all the stuff that was working just fine, 2 years ago, but now it's got to be connected to the internet. So this means that not only do these devices have computers in them running software, but they're also connected to the internet probably 24/7. And this has some important implications for cybersecurity. And so I think it's something we should understand a little better, and that is why you are here. So I tell you what, for starters, why don't you tell us a little bit more about Corellium and what is your role there? And what do you do there?
Sure. So Corellium is probably best known for what we do for mobile devices. So let me talk first about what we do for mobile devices, and I can then relate that to why I'm here, because I haven't much to do with mobile devices. So Corellium's technology is fundamentally a virtualization technology. We have the ability to take any workload or software payload designed to run on basically any ARM processor and run it on an ARM server. This gives us the ability to basically virtualize the behavior of any mobile phone. And Corellium is probably most famous for having a farm of virtual devices representing pretty much every iPhone, iPad, iPod too, back when that was a thing, out there running basically every version of iOS out there in both jailbroken and non-jailbroken forms. And people use this to do any manner of security research or vulnerability research, pen testing, and things like that, because it's a virtual version of a phone. And when you break it, and doing security research you often do, you can press a button and you get a brand new one coming out of here. You don't want to do that with the $1,000 iPhone you just went and bought from the Apple store, because you take it back and they don't want it back when you say, "Oh, by the way, I was trying to break it." So that's what Corellium does for its core business. I was brought on because at the heart of all of this is a fantastic hypervisor virtualization technology, which gives us the ability to basically virtualize not only mobile phone processors, but any ARM processor out there, and not just the application processors, but also the real-time embedded processors and the microcontroller processors out here. So we have the ability to run any sort of ARM payload, and this gives us the ability now to scale out and model that entire device, and now run software that would typically be limited to only run on physical devices. We can now run this in the cloud out here and virtualize the behavior of any ARM-based device. This now lets you take a flow that used to be tied to a physical device and now spin it up, run it in the cloud, and leverage all of these fantastic cloud-based development methodologies that web folks have been using for years, but now you can actually apply them to simpler, in theory, devices or smart devices or cars, basically anything that's ARM-based, and most things are becoming more and more ARM-based. You can run them in virtualized version in quantity 1 or quantity 1,000 or quantity 10,000. You might want to tell us before you spin up 10,000 so we can work with AWS. But that's the fundamental stuff over here. And my background is more in this non-mobile area and in the modeling space. Carbon Design Systems, the company I helped found, was all about modeling the components in the device in order to basically put up a virtual version before the device was available. Corellium just does this in a much better way for its target market. We're not trying to solve the hardware designer's problem. We're trying to solve the software designer's problem in here with this. And we've got a version that typically runs faster than the physical device that it's modeling, and can put that on everyone's virtual desk in any quantity.
Well, we used to struggle with that at Cisco when I was there, because a lot of our devices were expensive and they were fresh off the factory line. So a lot of times we didn't, even as engineers, didn't have copies of these things, and they were expensive. But we so we actually ended up using Raspberry Pis in a lot of cases to emulate these devices. So I've totally been there. I could totally see the value to that. That would be really, really helpful. We could have used actually probably something like that when we were doing it. But
I'll ask you for contacts after the call. Yeah.
But from audience's sake, what just at a basic level, what is an ARM processor like? And maybe compare that to Intel, which maybe if people understand processors might be more familiar with. What is the whole deal with ARM? And again, my audience may or may not understand what that is. So help us just understand at a high level what it is to be an ARM processor.
Well, it's interesting. I often go and speak at my alma mater. I went to Boston University here, and I'll go and I'll talk to the students and say, how many people here have heard of ARM? And I'll generally never get more than one or two hands raised out there. But ARM processors are the predominant processor architecture in the world. They ship, well, not they, but their partners ship upwards of 30 billion processors a year. And these processors are at the core of, almost everything anymore. Generally, any smartphone you have has, at least four ARM processors inside of it. Most of them have upwards of 8 to 10 nowadays. By the time you look at the modem and security subsystems inside of them, along with the application, so any smart device typically has one or more in these. But that same ARM processor can be adapted to power other things as well. And ARM has different variants, which can run inside of servers, which can run inside of IoT devices, which can run inside of auto. And, ARM doesn't actually build any of these chips itself.
Right.
It builds the core technology, and then it licenses it to everyone else. And this is an area that it's very different than what Intel does. Intel builds the chip, and it sells that chip to people that they then incorporate inside. So, they take the process from, initial concept to design to build to manufacture, and then they hand that off to everyone else. ARM just does the first couple of steps and, then licenses that technology either in processor form or in just architecture form for others to incorporate into their designs. And then ARM takes a royalty. So ARM charges you to use their design and then takes a percentage of of whatever fee you get for that design when you sell it out. And this was the revolutionary business model that ARM put out when it first came out. I'm sure someone else probably did it first, but ARM perfected it in here. But that's the fundamental difference between ARM and Intel is the licensing model and the IP model that surrounds all of these.
Well, and I think famously, one of the biggest proponents of that now is Apple. Apple Silicon is based on ARM architecture, which is a huge shift and a major win for Apple. I mean, their processes are just phenomenal. But that's getting too far off in the weeds. I'm an Apple guy though, so I had to say something. So, all right, let's talk about smart devices. What is the basic anatomy of a smart device before we get into some of the details? Like, I don't think people really think about what these things really are on the inside. They buy these toasters and refrigerators and light bulbs and things that are smart. They don't look like computers, but nevertheless, they're running code, and they've got a little chip in there that is a computer, a small computer, and it's communicating over the internet. So we've already talked a little bit about ARM, but like what other when we're thinking about these tiny little devices, what sorts of hardware and software are actually in these things? Like how would these compare to most people think of traditional computers?
Well, I mean, it can now vary depending upon the application. Some of these smart devices are just a computer attached to something else. You mentioned earlier using Raspberry Pis to model certain things. A Raspberry Pi can be used as a computer. It's got an HDMI port, a USB port. If you so desire, you could use it as your desktop computer. There are others, however, who have taken that same Raspberry Pi and they've embedded it inside another box, and it's all hidden away. It's used as a controller, and it controls that. And fundamentally, that's what a smart device is. It's basically just a device into which some manner of computing technology has been applied, and that can be done, using any manner of different mechanisms. Like I said, you can take a device and just stick it inside and hide it. You can typically they like to get a little smarter about this and actually, build this into the control logic and, then put it on the network and such from there and control it. But, it's typically a family of microcontrollers, for this that have incorporated a lot of these functions inside of this. And there are a bunch of different folks out here who've taken, a processor core tied together with typically some sort of networking on here. Since to me, a smart device fundamentally needs networking at some level in order to really communicate with the outside world, because, your typical smart device doesn't have a monitor and it doesn't have a keyboard. And so to me, that's probably the difference between a smart device and a computer is just the interaction mechanism that you have with it. If you don't have a keyboard and you don't have a monitor on it, but it communicates with the network. That to me is, now it's a smart device and not a computer. Some people could be a smart device and a computer in there, and then somebody's going to blur that line. But, to me, that's, really where the line gets drawn, and what's happening is these smart devices are getting more and more powerful as people try and do more and more things with them in here. And so this line is getting more and more blurred, on here. All of the problems that we have with computers are working their way down into smart devices as well, especially as people recognize that, there are a lot more of these and they're a lot less secure out there. And so they're a rich target, which I'm sure we'll talk more about as the discussion goes on.
Indeed. Yeah, these the Raspberry Pi is probably the better known. If anybody's looked at this stuff at all, they're really amazing. For like $35, they're about the size of a deck of cards. And it comes with USB ports and HDMI out port. And like you said, all you got to do is hook up a monitor, a keyboard, a mouse, and power supply. And you've got yourself a fully functioning computer if you want one. It's not fast, but I mean, compared to, most other computers. But I've messed around with these things. They make little hobbyist things of these that are not much bigger than a postage stamp. And it's still the Raspberry Pi basic processor. Their ARM processor is amazing. So, okay. So when I'm designing and manufacturing an IoT device, what special considerations need to be made for security? For example, these things have lower processing power, and they've also got razor-thin profit margins. These things, a lot of these devices, even though they seem expensive, are still sold with, not a lot of headroom for things like, security. As I'm designing for these devices, what sort of considerations do I have? How much different is, writing software or thinking about security is for a device this small or this cheap or this low of profit margin?
Well, I mean, you said the magic buzzword in there a few times, and that's cost. There's one thing on what you'd like to do, and another thing on what you can do on all of this stuff. Because as you mentioned, a lot of these things, security wasn't necessarily thought of when it first, when it was first designed, and a lot of IoT devices aren't running on the latest and greatest designs. They're running on something a few generations old. Security may be the concern nowadays that everyone's seeing, but it probably wasn't when the chip for that IoT device was actually designed and integrated. So a lot of times you could be working on something that, is 10, 15 years old, inside of here. So you don't have the modern mechanisms around all of this because of the cost constraint on all of this. And, on top of that, they probably don't want to give you a processor that has too much headroom in it because there is planned obsolescence inside of all of this stuff. They don't want to sell you an IoT device that's going to be good for the next 20 years because they want you to come back in 5, 10 years later, in order to bring you on to the next generation. And in fairness, people like me are going to buy that, but not everyone has a home full of smart devices like I do around here. But, when you're doing this design, ideally, you're doing it with, the latest and greatest stuff. You're doing it something that has some of the built-in security features. ARM has come a long way proposing standards and pushing them forward in here, as have other folks who play in the IoT space. I'm closer to ARM on here. It's my background. And they are the dominant player in here, but they've come a long way. But that doesn't mean that that's what everyone is necessarily using. You can still go out there and buy microcontrollers based on the ARM Cortex A9, which is something that's been around for 15 years, and that's still overkill as far as the processing power needed for some of this stuff.
And I'm sure they're cheaper.
So, yeah. So why spend the money on that stuff that may be more secure and stuff when this older stuff meets my needs? And so it all comes back to cost. And fundamentally, it needs to be recognized that security itself, or not being secure, it has its own cost that comes along with it. And I think for too long it's been that not being secure doesn't have much of a cost associated with it. Yeah, you'll read in the news every once in a while about a new exploit or things that come out, but you never really see much in the way of companies going bankrupt because their product had the security vulnerability and such inside there. And maybe that balance needs to shift a bit here to make companies a bit more liable for it. And you see that people would actually start making it more secure inside of there, because I think cost is the overriding concern. And if there's no cost to be paid for being insecure, then people won't up the budgets that they have on making a device secure in the first place.
Yeah, it's one of the weirdest things that for a country as litigious as the United States is, and all the product liability lawyers and things that are out there in class action lawsuits, maybe it's the terms of service that we all agree to that we never look at, that say, you must submit to arbitration and all software is applied as is. And, for whatever reason, software companies seem to have gotten a pass. And, I'm not sure how much longer that can last. Because you're right, there's no, all the market forces are there to not support security. They're there for profitability, and profitability and security usually don't go hand in hand. Anyway, I could go down that rabbit hole for a long way. So, but more on a technical level, for folks, in the cybersecurity industry, we love to say that the S in IoT is for security, which of course means there isn't any. That's the joke. But I mean, these are computers. I mean, are these IoT devices significantly more vulnerable in some fundamental way to hacking or to malware than what we think of as more regular computers? Is there a fundamental security difference in characteristics between these types of computers?
Well, I mean, as we started off the conversation with, a smart device and a computer don't differ all that much, especially with the newer generation stuff. A smart device, oftentimes you can even have what's almost a full computer inside of it. The difference is that there are typically a lot more smart devices coming from a bunch of different places inside the home. So I touched briefly on my own home. My own home, admittedly, I might be a little bit of a geek on this, but I've got over 100 devices on my Wi-Fi network, in various capacities. 2 of these are computers. So 2 of these, I run the latest and greatest virus software on. I always apply the latest updates and things like that. I keep entirely updated. If I look at the rest of my network, and I'm in the biz, I work for a security company. I'd like to think I know what I'm doing from this standpoint, but I think there are 17 different manufacturers of the devices on my network. I will guarantee you I don't know what all of those devices are. I guarantee you I don't know the latest patch levels on all of those. And although I'd like to say that I'm up to date on these various things, I can all but guarantee you there's at least one device on my network that isn't up to the latest patch level on all of this stuff. And that's me. I'd like to believe I have at least some idea of what I'm doing in this space. You go to my mom's house, and, my mom gets kind of some of my tech handoffs and things like that. So she's got some of this stuff. I know she doesn't update because whenever I go back for Christmas, I update all of her stuff. And my mom is far more like the average user out there, on here. Yeah. They've got a collection of stuff. They've gotten it from various sources, and they put it on the network once. They never do anything more with it. This means that it wasn't designed completely securely in the first place, and it'll be low. I'd like to think they are, but I mean, there's a reason people keep making patches, on here. So, that if it's not kept up to date, it's going to be an area for security vulnerability. And, these devices move from place to place. And on top of that, they all interface with our mobile phones, or most of them interface with our mobile phones. And the mobile phone is the link in this that it's often not really talked about a whole bunch. They talk about, secure your Wi-Fi and secure your network on this. But, you're carrying around your biggest security vulnerability in here with your mobile phone. You're constantly installing apps on it. You're constantly bringing it onto other networks. You're constantly walking around and exposing it to people who can be attacking for any nefarious means, and then bring it home, as a secured portal onto your home network. And by the way, logging on to all of these various apps to control some of these devices you don't know where they came from. Any one of these can expose a security hole. And all it takes is one way in, and now you've given someone a secured access in all of this stuff. And that, to me, is where IoT is a bigger security problem than, almost anything else, is because, it can be the gateway to get secured access in. And oftentimes it's because we're letting it.
Yeah, right.
I've got 3 different brands of cameras in my house for various reasons, and I want to be able to look at them when I'm outside the home. So,
right,
and everyone else does too, because what good is having a doorbell camera if I can't see who's at my door when I'm out getting groceries? So there's a portal inside of there. I'd like to leave it secure. Who knows on that? But that's a portal that I've opened because I want that, and other people do the same thing, and that is fundamentally an area of we're trading off comfort for security.
Well, and you mentioned software updates, which is crucial, and a lot of these devices aren't updatable. I mean, a lot of there is no way to update your smart toaster. If it doesn't update itself, There's no way for you to do it. Some of them have portals. Some of them have apps that you could connect to that might allow you to check the software, at least check the version, if not update it. And they're getting better, but man, it's certainly a lot of the older devices in general don't even have a way to update. So if they're broken, they're going to stay broken forever until you throw them away.
Yeah. Very true. I've got a smart oven out here. I have no idea how to update its firmware on here. I know that I'd like to because it sucks in about 5 different ways. But yeah, I have no idea how to update it.
So we talked a little bit about networking, though, and so most smart devices are connected to the network. That's almost part and parcel of the definition of a smart device today. And one of the things that can protect your home is your home router. That's what a lot of people don't think about it, but your home router has a firewall built into it. Your home router has even just network address translation, which makes it so that you have private IP addresses in your house that can't really be seen outside your house. That's, security by obscurity, basically. So how effective are these home routers at isolating and protecting devices from external attack? I mean, when we're talking about IoT devices, is that helping us a lot here? Is that keeping these devices from being hacked? Does it matter if they're wired versus wireless? I mean, most of them are wireless now, but there are some like streaming boxes and TVs that still have Ethernet ports on them. Talk to us a little bit about the home network security part of this.
Well, I mean, certainly, the router helps a lot. We don't have every single device sitting natively directly on the internet, unless you either really, really know what you're doing or really, really don't know what you're doing inside of there. Typically, most of these routers show up and put in a nice barrier on top of that. And assuming you actually go through and change the default root password on there, which unfortunately a lot of people don't, in there, it forms a nice barrier on that. Somewhat. Like I said, I've got three different types of cameras on my home network. I've done nothing to set up firewalls and things like that on them. They are behind NAT, so I can't ping them from outside, but they attach to a cloud service, so that they can route through, and I can attach to that.
Right.
There is now a portal through, and in addition, that cloud service has a bunch of other users attaching to it as well. So, if I'm a hacker, do I go after a home, or do I go after a cloud service that a bunch of other things attach to, and then attack out from there? So, I think that we've deluded people into a false sense of security on there by saying, secure your home network and you're safe. But, I mean, we regularly attach our home networks to other people's networks, and those are much richer attack targets, but we've given them kind of secured backdoors into ours. So, yeah, get a new router, do everything to make it secure, but, be aware of the fact that, you are consciously taking that and attaching it to everyone else. And like I said, and you're bringing a mobile phone on top of this as well, which is also bridging, an outside network into ours. And most of the times we kind of just trust our mobile phones, on this. But, if I was a hacker trying to gain access to someone's network, I'd probably first check the default passwords on that because no one changes them and they're a nice way in. But, I mean, the next thing I'd do is say, I'll go in through their mobile phone. And that's probably a better way in than anything else. And it's a trusted device as soon as you get in there. And it's a trusted device with a lot of compute power that I can probably hide something in and they won't even notice on there. So, yeah, the home router can give you some sense of security, and it being wired, yeah, that's somewhat nice as well. But, like I said, if I'm going to attack a device, it's probably not going to matter whether or not it's wired or wireless. I'm going to attack the cloud service it attaches to and come in that way.
So a lot of people's home networks and corporate networks used to be like this, but they've gotten better. But home networks are like old-time corporate networks, which we just call the M&M defense, where it's crunchy on the outside and soft on the inside, which is to say that once, you try to keep people out from getting in your network, but once they're in, they can do whatever they want. And they have free access. So one of the things I often recommend to people is that they segregate their network, that they actually use their guest network, which was a lot of modern routers have that feature built in. Most people don't use it, I don't think, by default. But so what I tell a lot of people to do is to take these relatively less secure, cheapo special devices, these IoT devices that have questionable or dubious security, and put them on the guest network, and to keep them segregated from their computers. And that works as long as you don't have to have an app on your phone that's on the same network that needs to talk to it. But first of all, do you agree with that recommendation? And second, do you have any other maybe recommendations, other things you already mentioned, updating the firmware, I guess, and changing default passwords? So maybe we've covered the basics, but is there anything else you can think of that people might want to do to mitigate the risks from having a lot of IoT devices on their network?
Well, it's interesting. You talk about guest networks, and I've certainly got routers capable of doing them as well, but I don't use them. It's cumbersome in there. So, I've got Sonos devices in here. They're wonderful devices. I love them. We've got them in pretty much every room that I spend any time in my house. But if I want to control them with my phone, I've got to be on the same network as them. I can't access them from a different network. And, and my guests, when they come into the home, they want to do the same thing. My guests all have Sonos, well, not all of them, but, a lot of them have Sonos at their own place. They like the ability to log in and can do that. So do I let some people access my network and some people not? What do you feel like to create a second-class citizen on here? And it gets worse. I've got Chromecasts attached to my TV to do streaming. You got to be on the same network for that too, or at least to do it easily. They've got guest modes for that now too, but my mom doesn't know how to use it. And it comes down to, is these things that exist that I can do in here and do all of that. How difficult do I want to make it for anyone else? And if I'm setting this up in my mom's network, how many calls do I want to take from her on a regular basis? And it's like, well, my sister came over and she's on the Wi-Fi and I can't watch the video and I want to watch a video. It's like, okay, well, tell her to go on to this. It's
right.
It's one of these things where it creates a different class, and it's great as a default mechanism to do that, but personally, I don't do it in here on that stuff. And am I setting myself up for a potential vulnerability at some point in time down the road? Yeah, possibly. But, security is always a game of risks on here.
Yes.
Like I said, my personal belief is I have a higher chance of getting hacked because of the cloud services all of these things attached to, rather than anyone caring about getting direct access into my personal network. I've got as I mentioned, I've got 3 different cameras in here. One of them from a more dubious maker will occasionally reset itself and click and run around the room. So I don't power that one on very often because I just assume it's hacked in some mechanism on here. But I haven't done anything else with it, on here. So it's a certain standard of care. But for me, I'd like to. I personally favor ease of use over that extra bit of security in here, because I don't believe it's all that much more secure in there personally from that. But, I do tend to go through, and as you mentioned, I keep device updated. I've got, like I mentioned, I've got a house full of smart apps, of smart devices. I think I have 17. I think I counted I think I have 17 different apps that control the devices on that. And I open each one of those at least once a month, because they all, because they don't always necessarily alert you on these various things, or there's a new terms of service you've got to agree to before they download new updates and stuff like that. So I try and go through and update, and open each one of these at least once a month, go through and update the firmware and stuff associated with that. Also, we've all got voice assistants nowadays, or at least a lot of us do. Some of us are a little more,
some holdouts for sure, but
yeah. And, but it's interesting. Some people will let their voice assistant do anything. I don't. I don't let them do drop-ins. I don't let them buy things. I think letting your voice assistant buy things is just nuts on here. Now, some of it's because I'm kind of fussy, and I don't want to buy whatever device the voice assistant just goes off and does. But also, I don't want some guy being able to stand outside my window and say, famous voice assistant name, because I can't say it too loud because it'll trigger somewhere else, buy this, and then wait for it to show up on my porch and go get that. That to me are the more obvious, things are, on here. And as we do more and more to control these devices with voice and other mechanisms, that's a whole new mechanism that is tougher to control. I could have the best security in the world, but if someone can stand outside the window and yell things at my voice assistant and break my security that way, unlock my doors, or order things, how secure is my network really?
Yeah, I just talked about that in this week's episode. One of the stories was actually hackers using ultrasound to give commands to voice assistants that you couldn't hear, but it could hear, which I thought was really interesting. Yeah.
So you're going to make me paranoid. You're going to make me paranoid about a whole new class of things here, Carrie.
That's what we strive to do on this show. All right. So, people might be thinking, okay, great. So somebody hacks my toaster. So what? Or somebody hacks my smart light bulb. Maybe they're going to make it flash. What are they going to do? But there are actual real world impacts, maybe not to you, but to other devices around the planet. And I'm leading you into things like DDoS attacks, but what are some of the downsides, or what are some of the real world impacts for insecurity on these IoT devices? Because we think about maybe the direct impacts, but there are some kind of indirect impacts as well.
Well, certainly there are the direct impacts. If you've got anything compromised on your network, it can steal any manner of personal information and relay it off to people who can do really bad things with it. Every one of my phone's got all my credit card information on it in some manner on that. If I've got some device that can, on my trusted network that can come and do things with it, yeah, suddenly I'm exposed. But yeah, it is more about just us. It is, these IoT devices are real easy to, get all aligned and start doing DDoS attacks or start propagating worms or things like that. And the bad thing is, since these things don't all communicate just over one network protocol, they oftentimes go peer-to-peer or stuff like that. It's not just a simple manner of taking down the Wi-Fi hub and assuming that you've removed its means of communication. Half my devices communicate on Zigbee or something else like that, where,
Right.
You can get an infection and spread it all out. And so now eradicating that is extremely difficult to do with all of this stuff. And so, that, is the real big gotcha with IoT, is just the breadth of the attack surface and the spreading surface as it comes in and all of this stuff. So the problem just isn't internal; it's external, and it can propagate out in many different ways.
Well, one of the funny stories I had a friend of mine tell me was that he had a buddy who had a smart light bulb, and these are light bulbs. You could change the color, you could change the brightness, you can change the temperature, blah blah blah, with a little phone app, and it's kind of fun. Of course, turn it on off and on, and it was starting to flicker. It was starting to flash, and he couldn't figure it out. And he wasn't a technical guy, but he knew a technical guy, somebody I knew, and they came over and checked it out and poked around at this device, and sure enough, this device had been hacked. And so the reason it was flickering was because it was doing a lot of other processing in the background and couldn't keep up with its normal function. So the way it expressed that was it was not doing its job properly. And otherwise, this guy would not have known it. It was probably some part of some botnet or something. The user would probably never have known it. But just FYI, the solution was to unplug it and plug it back in, because a lot of the malware that hits a lot of these IoT devices only runs in RAM, because a lot of these devices don't have a hard drive per se. So once if you turn it off and turn it back on, a lot of times it's flushed basically. So just there's a little minor tidbit for you. Okay, so you mentioned Zigbee. And I want to dig into that a little bit too, because you're right. A lot of these devices, home automation was going to be the next big thing. Everything was going to be home automated, and all your devices are going to be smart, and they're all going to talk to each other. The problem is nobody could settle on the language, because everybody wanted to control the language. Everybody wanted to own the language. And so there were many languages. As we like to say, the nice thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. So there was Zigbee, there was Z-Wave, there was SmartThings, there was many, many others. But there appears to be, fingers crossed, this other thing that's called Matter. So this new protocol called Matter. I don't know why they chose that name. It seems like an odd name, but anyway, that's what it's called. And it seems to have some promise. Maybe it's going to, one standard to finally, one ring to rule them all. So can you tell us a little bit, maybe people don't think about this, but you mentioned it. So how do these devices use these proprietary protocols to talk to each other? What is Matter? And, do you have any confidence that maybe Matter is going to finally unify all of our smart devices?
Well, I mean, at first blush, Matter has kind of the same problem as everything else. As you mentioned, it's a new standard. But the nice thing on this one is it at least has all the main players behind it. I think there are over 280 players that have signed up for it. So from a weight standpoint, it has a weight to it that no other standard has managed to achieve yet on here. And, it's got, not only are they signed up, because, anyone will sign up for things in here, but, they're contributing and advancing this. And, a lot of these big players have actually started putting out releases, on this stuff. So, there's some there, on this, and they've started coming up with this. And I think it's because, a lot of these people have realized that the protocol isn't a differentiator on here. I'm not going to buy something really fundamentally because it's got this protocol. I think what they've finally done here is come together and made the protocol a commodity. And basically said, as long as you have this, everyone's going to have it. You can't differentiate on it. Go differentiate on something that matters.
Right.
To use it to coin a term on here, and to me, I think that's what the way they really finally did with this is basically said your value add shouldn't just be this fancy new protocol you come up with and such. Your value add should be hopefully ease of use, since that's really what fundamentally is holding a lot of this stuff back is ease of use. Well, like I mentioned, I've got all of these different devices, but I'm a geek. Of course, I'm fine with doing that. My mom can't do that. My mom doesn't want to do that. My mom wants, to do one, to have one way of controlling everything in there, and ideally that one way isn't calling me up whenever anything breaks, on here. So Matter has the promise of doing this. It's not just a singular protocol. It's two protocols. One to basically do the configuration and then one to do the communication on this. But it has the promise of actually bringing everyone together around this, and it actually looks like it's starting to happen. The first certification stuff came out towards the end of last year. The first devices are rolling out now.
Yeah.
There aren't a whole bunch of them yet, but they're actually you've got folks like SmartThings and Philips and Hue and stuff like that rolling this out to some of their legacy devices. Now, they're not fully Matter compliant, but, they're doing their best to bring them along. And, Wi-Fi 6, the new, that's being rolled out in the new routers, supposedly has the ability to support the Thread protocol, which is the new standard for communication inside of Matter, on here, and to do this and to basically migrate to something where you don't even need proprietary hubs anymore, because you just need an enabled router. Of course, it means everyone's got to replace their router, but maybe this is how they maybe this is how they got all the people involved. It's going to I'll let you sell a new router on here, and maybe that was the pitch they made to them on here. But I mean, the fundamental difference on this one is that it seems to have the weight behind it for adoption, and of course, time will tell as to whether or not it actually happens. I've got my fingers crossed, because like I say, make my life a lot easier. I think I have 4 different style hubs in my personal network. It'd be nice to eliminate all of them, on this. Of course, I've already got them wired and already made the investment, so it's not going to burn me if it doesn't. But it sure would make my networking life a little easier if this all came down to. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
I am too, and I'm starting to see some of the devices roll out. I'm anxious to try some of them. And like, for example, I'm an Apple guy, so I've got iPhone, and on that Apple's home networking thing is the Apple Home app. And I've got several of my devices that are home compatible, and they're really nice. Like when you first open them up, they've got a little QR code that you scan, and Apple's smart enough to know that when you scan that, it's a home device and just set up as a breeze. But not all of them do. In fact, I've got some from the same manufacturer that work, some from that manufacturer that work with Apple Home, and some that don't. Eufy cameras. I've got a Eufy I've got a Eufy doorbell, video doorbell, that does not work with Apple Home Video and Apple Home, but I've got 2 other Eufy cameras that I use inside the house that do. I don't know why that is. I don't know why a software update can't just fix that, but apparently it can't. But anyway, they need to be turnkey. They need to be plug and play. And for that, again, my mother's is also my avatar. Like when I think about if this stuff's going to work, she's got to be able to do it without calling me first. And so I'm hoping as you are, that Matter is going to solve that particular problem and make these things better. And then what I'm really hoping actually is that cybersecurity will somehow improve with this Matter. I haven't looked into this yet, and I don't know if you have, but does Matter come with it as part of the Matter spec? Does it include, do they think about cybersecurity as part of the spec, or is that completely still separate from Matter?
I have to admit, I've not done a whole bunch of research into this aspect as well. But I mean, if you think about it, from a fundamental level, once we're all fully adopted with Matter, it should be more secure, just by the very nature of we've reduced the attack surface, right? We've reduced down from all of these various possible protocols and various networks and myriad class of hubs that all need to be updated and things like this, down to a hubless approach So there's less attack surface to two protocols, Bluetooth and Thread on here, as opposed to a whole bunch of other stuff on here. So just from narrowing the number of attack points, it should in theory go down. And one would also like to think that and neither one of us has done the research on here, but one would also like to think that a standard coming out in these modern times would have at least given a nod to security inside of here and rolled it out with that in mind. If not, then I think I know what one of us should start a business doing.
Well, no, I think that's exactly right. And that was another point I was making as you were talking, and you said it, is that the fact that it is a standard, the fact that multiple companies need to get together and work on this collectively makes it less proprietary, makes it less, arcane and unknown. I think a lot of times companies really screwed up when they try to roll their own security, and so getting together with other big companies and stamping your name on something like this, I think at least has the opportunity for these things to be better, and more secure, less bugs, things like that. We can only hope. Okay, so we've talked a lot about security. We haven't talked a lot about privacy, though we have alluded to it off and on throughout the interview so far. But there are a lot of privacy implications when you talk about Internet of Things. And, what's to stop smart devices from collecting personal data and even from scanning your network, right? If they're on your network and they're not on the guest network, if they're on a network with other juicy devices that have, info that you might learn about your network, or even just learning about the devices in your network and reporting back on that, this telemetry data or this other information, it could be scanning your network. And so, as you said, you've got 17 on your phone. A lot of these, smart devices, manufacturers have a companion app that they want you to install as well, which has more permissions and things that they want you to give. Give me access to your contacts, give me access to your GPS and all these other things that they probably don't need. But there's just yet more privacy things. So Apple has a thing called Secure Home Video, which is supposed to be kind of like Matter. It's a pseudo standard. It's an Apple standard, but they're trying to get other people to adopt it because Secure Home Video means that only you, actually not even Apple, supposedly will have access to your video. So do you think that things like Matter might address some privacy concerns as well? Could we hope?
Potentially, but fundamentally Matter is about establishing a protocol on here, not what gets done, with that or how it gets used. And on top of that, and this is the whole gotcha on here is, we touched earlier on these agreements that we all agree to but never read. The standard can say one thing and such like that, but all it takes is a legal agreement to give that right away. On some of these things. Now, the phone has done phones have done a great job with this, because as you mentioned, you install something now and it wants to look at your GPS. Your phone actually pops up something that says it's trying to access GPS. Do you want to let it do this? Now, I suppose, and this is something maybe I should have done a little more research on this from this, but one could look at Matter and say, could or should the Matter standard incorporate something like this? It's kind of like, this device on your network is trying to interrogate the status of these other things. One should, of course, think you should be able to see if other devices exist, but should it be able to, how far should that be able to go? Right. Should it be able to query and see what software rev they're running? Should it be able to query and see what personal information they've gathered and stuff like that? And, I think, that's probably where that's going to need to end up going. And, it could have actually done this. This is an area where, honestly, I don't know on here, but I can imagine how difficult that would be to do inside of that, because, things that one person may think are necessary and needed, like which software rev. It'd be nice to know that I'm talking to something of the compatible rev, but, knowing which software rev I'm running could also be used by hackers to say, oh, well, this is running at this rev, it's already patched. It's not a soft target. I need to go find a soft target. So things that are useful for one purpose can be very, very soft targets for doing security analysis in there as well. So, that could certainly give a follow-on threat to privacy on this. But, honestly, like I said, going back to all of that, I think, our biggest privacy concern is the stuff we're carrying around in our pockets on here. That's where that's where we're giving up all that information. That's where I type in my credit card information. I've never given my credit card information directly to one of my IoT devices, but I've certainly given it to my IoT devices apps on my phone. That to me is the area that needs to be secured down more on here. the security around apps and making sure that they're not leaking information. That's the biggest set of security holes that I think needs to be fixed. This touches a bit on the other half of Corellium, the part that focuses on the mobile security. But I look at some of the security holes and privacy holes that people find in apps all the time, on here, and it proves that security and privacy can't just afford to be an afterthought when you're designing the apps on here. The apps control the IoT, so that's the overlap on here, but they expose your information in all sorts of different directions. And for me, if I'm investing my money on where I want to tighten security, it's probably on the apps that control IoT more than the IoT device itself, because the really lucrative stuff, my credit card information, it's all in the app.
Well, and maybe this is dreaming, and maybe it's just pie in the sky thinking, but I'd love to think that if there really is a standard, and I'm not sure exactly how open Matter is, but I would have to think you could license it. So what I would love to be able to do then is I would love to build a third-party hub, maybe done free and open source software. Maybe someone comes up with their own version of the hub software, so I don't have to use the one that came with the company. And the other thing I'd kind of like to see combined with this, there are products like Portmaster and Lulu and Little Snitch that are actually kind of reverse firewalls that let you watch the devices that are trying to communicate out. And because now we've got so many devices that may be phoning home and who knows who they're calling, I would love to see all of this kind of put together, and the router seems like the perfect place personally for me to do this. So I could kind of imagine that eventually we'll have your home router is their home hub as well. And so I want that router to maybe allow my IoT devices to talk to the manufacturer, but and their accepted one in the US, but not all of a sudden start phoning back to China. I don't know, have some sort of connection level access to that and having more visibility into that, because the hub is something that is by a third party, not by the manufacturer. I don't know. Well, I don't know if we'll ever get to something like that.
Well, I mean, as we touched on, Matter gets rid of the need for proprietary hubs.
Yeah,
So your first desire is already there. You can use your home router as the hub for all of this stuff. And Thread, the way it's based, means that actually our devices can communicate without needing to go up to the cloud, which is a nice benefit as well. On here. So it should, in theory, minimize all of that. And there are ways to limit what one device can communicate with. Out there in the outside world. I don't know if Matter itself incorporates that standard, but I know my router, I can limit where all any one device talks to. So it may not be as far off as you would think on here. Of course, most of my devices were made in China, and most of them refer to servers in China for their firmware updates. So and I'd like to get those firmware updates, and so where do I draw the line? On here, and I think that's the gotcha in all of this stuff, because if I'm a bad actor, I just say, well, of course it needs to talk to these servers over here. How else is it going to get an update?
Well, the other thing I'd always loved too is it was, especially with these home assistants. I love the idea of the home assistant. I love the utopian universe of Star Trek where you say computer and you'd ask it a question, and if you ever watch Star Trek, there's no thought about privacy. Like, just assume that the computer is only talking to you and they're not going to give up your secrets. I would love also for this hub to be that. Like, a lot of times these smart speakers, because they don't have the processing power, will record your snippet and send it to the cloud for interpretation and then get the response back. I would like that to all happen in my house. I would like to have a hub that has that capability built into it so that I control where all that stuff goes through, so it never leaves my home. That'd be great. Anyway, more pie in the sky thinking. All right, last question. I know we touched on this a little bit already, but for whatever reason, we have managed to give a pass, I think, to a lot of these software makers when things go bad, and we have not held them accountable. But in recent, even year, maybe not even plural, the U.S. has really kind of gotten involved, the U.S. government in particular, and I've liked what I've seen, like NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technology, I think is NIST, has put out some IoT security guidelines, and even the White House has put out a strategy document around this topic. So what is it going to take? I mean, the market really isn't there to pressure these companies to do these things. There's not people filing class action lawsuits and winning big things that cause other companies to tighten things up. What's it going to take to really improve the security of these smart devices? If nothing else, could we maybe get more transparency about like the relative security of these devices so the market can kind of function? Like, because, my mom's looking at two things on the shelf. She can't hold two things in her hand and say, well, looking at the labels, I can see this one's more secure than that one, or this one's more private than that one. There's no transparency in these things. Do we just need regulations, or is there technical solutions? What is, I know I'm asking for a lot here, but what's your opinion on how we might be able to fix this problem?
Well, it's interesting. You can kind of see how we got to where we are, right? If you open the bounds for all litigation and liability and things like that in the early days of an industry, it just doesn't grow, right? So you can see why we put these protections in place in order to say, you're not liable for these various things. You're just a router sending in information, and the fact that it can be used to route bad things in, well, that's not your fault. That's coming from somewhere else, on that, and that was necessary in order to get these industries off the ground, over here. But one of the things that was in that strategy document that came out is a very important line. And in fact, I want to even read the line in here on here, and it says, "We must begin to shift the liability onto those entities that fail to take reasonable precautions to secure their software." And that, to me, is underlines the step that I really think needs to be made on here. And it's not saying that you need to take liability for the actions of others on here. It's just if there's known security things out here and you're not taking steps on your side in order to ensure them, then you should be liable for what happens out there. Now, there should be limits and things like this. It shouldn't be uncapped and all that other stuff. But at the very first step, you should be responsible for making your device secure and such from there. And I think that should be a necessary first step on the way of handling this. I mean, love them or hate them, and I have to love them. My brother's a lawyer, and here, lawyers tend to make a lot of things happen in this world, and and that's the part of the lawyers that we all hate, including myself and including my brother, the lawyer, on here, because they sometimes overcorrect on the other side. But I think there needs to be some means to let litigation balance this out, and shift the burden of responsibility a bit here more to make the companies a bit more responsible for ensuring that these things are secure. I don't want to overcorrect on this side and shut everything down.
Right. Yeah.
But I think there should be a means of establishing some sort of fair policies around here, and ensuring that known security things are fixed within X amount of time. In here, and you establish some means to make sure that these updates are actually done, and not just like when I have to go back in and open up these apps once a month in order to make sure they have there needs to be a balance in what that is. I don't know. The problem is technology is going to advance faster than the law, and all of these things. If we don't start trying to make progress, we'll never move forward, on here. And it's nice to see the conversation being started. I know it's being pushed back again in multiple different areas, but I think moving security from an afterthought and something which is only done once per product release, like it is now, to being something that's done with every check-in. Every time software is modified, you don't just do your smoke test to make sure it doesn't, it doesn't break any functionality, but you also test it for security. It didn't introduce any new security holes. Just having that step come in, because far too often it's not done that way today. Just that would go a long way towards securing things up.
All right, Bill, that was a lot of fun talking about that. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really had a great time.
Thank you, Kerry. It was great talking with you as well.
Thanks again to Bill for coming on the show and explaining IoT security to us. And that was a timely discussion, because IoT security is really bad, and technologies like Matter will hopefully be making things better. And of course, companies like Corellium that allow software developers and product developers to test this stuff rigorously before it even gets in our hands will hopefully be making these things even better. Some of these U.S. government initiatives that are trying to improve security will be taking effect, hopefully in the coming years. And not too many. And unfortunately, we're still going to have to get rid of a lot of the devices we currently have, which are not that great. But these will be good reasons for you to upgrade to better, newer devices as they come out. Or maybe to finally get into the IoT space if you've been worried about things like security and privacy. They will be getting better. And hopefully, as a consumer, you will be given the means to determine which of these things are more secure and more private than others. Now, I do want to make a special call out for this Raspberry Pi thing. And that's a weird name. And by the way, that's P-I, not P-I-E. It's a play on pie, the edible dessert, but it's more pi like the Greek letter pi. And these are really amazing little computers. If you wanted to mess around with some simple home electronics projects, it basically will let you turn something into a smart device or create your own little smart device. These things are, again, the base unit is $35. It's about the size of a deck of cards. It comes with multiple USB ports, an HDMI port, a little slot for an SD card, because that's basically its hard drive / memory. You have to put a little SD card in it, and a little place for you to connect it to power. At this point, it's usually a USB power. And if you just want to have a little Linux computer to mess around with, you just connect a keyboard and a mouse on a monitor, and there you go. You've got yourself a computer that you can play around with. If you want to maybe learn to program or do some coding or just learn Linux, that's a great way to go. But you could also create really fun standalone electronics projects. I put a link in the show notes. You can check some of these things out, like some of the common, simpler things. You could make a little home weather station, that checks the temperature and humidity and wind speed and things like that. That could be fun. You can make a little streaming box. Maybe you can set up a little smart camera if you want to catch some wildlife in your backyard when they're moving around. I'm thinking about creating a little Raspberry Pi project to monitor my mailbox, to let me know when it's been opened and closed, and perhaps even put a little camera in there so I can see if there's currently anything in my mailbox. And this whole Raspberry Pi ecosystem is vast, and there are others as well. But I mean, you can get versions of the Raspberry Pi that is not much bigger than a old style, package of gum. Some as even small as a postage stamp for maybe $10. They're great for educational use too. This was an amazing project that was started several years back, and it spawned all sorts of other similar projects. They really are cool. If you want to play around with electronics or coding or Linux or something, these are great little devices for that. Check the links in the show notes if you want to find out more. And by the way, I did look a little bit more into the security and privacy aspects of the new Matter IoT standard, and it definitely appears that they have strived to build both of those into that framework. With encrypted communications, like all the communications between the devices now are encrypted. It's got like a certificate-based trust model to make sure that there aren't rogue devices trying to get in on the network. They have a standard for over-the-air firmware updates, and it's an open standard. So, other people can review it as well, make suggestions. So it's going to be a good thing. It's not going to be a silver bullet, I'm sure, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. So be looking for that on your new IoT devices to see if they support the Matter standard. It's got a little icon if you want to, again, there's a link in the show notes if you want to look it up so that you'll recognize that icon. But that's what that is about. So as usual, I captured a little bit of bonus content from my patrons that will be dropping on Thursday. I asked about Bill's origin story and how he got to be where he is now. Everybody always has an interesting career path and how they got to where they are today. And then I asked him some more technical details on how they emulate mobile devices. So for the patrons, as usual, you'll be getting that on Thursday morning. So next week will be a news show as usual. Already plenty of things to cover there, including the FBI telling you not to charge your devices in public USB ports, and thieves being able to steal cars by tapping into the network through the headlight. So there's lots of interesting stories we'll be covering next week. And then after that, I've got an interview with the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, a really interesting group that's doing some great work up in New York City, but that honestly affects all of us. So lots of great stuff in the pipeline. Subscribe if you haven't. That way you won't miss any of this great content coming up. If you haven't already, check out the book, check out the blog, the newsletter. And if you want some cool Dragon swag, check out the merch store. Links to all of that, of course, in the show notes. That'll do it for this week, everybody. Take care, stay safe, and until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.